Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
My dad called me a week before his birthday and told me he wanted the whole family together for dinner because he had something important to share, and even though the tone was dressed up as thoughtful and inclusive, I heard the old familiar edge in it. The one that says this is not a request, this is a performance, and you will sit where you are told and smile when it is your turn. So I agreed. I said of course, and then I hung up and stared at the wall because I already knew what kind of night it would be. The kind where the plates are set out and the small talk is sweet and the little barbs are tucked into compliments that land like paper cuts you are not supposed to mention. I wish I could pretend I did not see it coming, but I grew up with a front row seat to the way things worked in our house, where my sister Emily was the sun and the rest of us orbited. And every time I accomplished something it turned into an anecdote about how Emily had done it earlier, or brighter, or in a way that somehow made mine smaller, and I learned to make peace with being told I was practical while she was called gifted. And I learned to do the unglamorous jobs no one clapped for, and I learned to keep my face calm when a compliment came with a condition attached. So when he said important, I knew it meant important for him, and when he said family, I understood it meant an audience. I told myself I was not going there to be bait. I was going because I am an adult who can withstand a few hours of family theater, and also because I wanted to see how honest he would be when he delivered whatever decision he had already made. And if I am being honest with you, I also wanted to test something in myself, because over the past year I stopped asking for fairness, and I started learning how power actually moves, which is not through speeches at birthdays, but through paperwork, timing, and a straight face that does not blink when someone tries to put you back in your assigned seat. The week before that dinner, I gathered documents no one knew I had. I took calls during my lunch breaks that I did not advertise. And I decided I was done handing over my piece in exchange for a version of family that never seemed to include me unless I was useful, and I know that sounds cold. But there is a difference between being disloyal and being done with volunteering for my own humiliation, and I was done, and because I have always been the practical one, I did what practical people do. When they get tired of speeches, I followed the rules that exist quietly in the background, the ones that are boring until suddenly they are not. On the day of the dinner, I rehearsed the smile I keep for these moments, the one that looks warm enough to pass, but not so eager that anyone mistakes it for weakness. And I promised myself that I would not reach for the same old arguments about fairness or love or what I deserved, because I have already learned how those conversations end. And I do not have an appetite for being told to calm down while someone explains my own life back to me, so I decided I would let them talk. I would let the compliments and the digs mingle like they always do, and I would not flinch, because this time the ground under the story was different, and only I knew it. My mom passed away years ago, and the family reconfigured itself around habits that were never questioned out loud, like the way Emily could ask for help and receive it without a single condition. While I was expected to be grateful for advice I had not asked for, and I carried those patterns into adulthood without noticing until last year when a crisis of my own did not fit the family script. And I realized that the people who love you can still use you as a prop when it suits them, and once you see that you cannot unsee it, so I stopped begging for new lines and wrote my own notes in the margins, and the note for that night was simple: stay calm, stay quiet, and do not rescue anyone from their choices. Walking into that dinner felt like walking into an old story I could recite by memory: the polite greetings, the quick check of who sat where, the little roll call of accomplishments for appearances, and I kept my face neutral and my voice even. Because the performance is easier to watch when you stop trying to rewrite it while it is happening, and I do not mean I was detached. I felt every small sting, and I remembered every time I had swallowed one just like it, but I kept my posture and I kept my plan, because plans do not need applause, they need patience. Dad was in a good mood, which is always a sign that he is about to present something he thinks is clever or brave, and he asked for another round of toasts like he always does, and everyone said the safe things, health and family and gratitude. And I said them too, because I am not here to burn anything down just to make a point. I am here to stop participating in a game that treats me like a spectator in my own life, and I could feel Emily watching me the way she always does when she knows something is coming and expects me to break first, and I gave her the practice smile that says I am fine, which was true in a way that she would not understand until later. If you have ever waited for a shoe to drop in a room full of people pretending they are just here to celebrate, then you know that strange mix of dread and control, the way you force your breathing to stay steady while your thoughts count off the beats. And I sat there thinking about all the times I had tried to earn a fair hearing with good behavior, and how I was done with that, and how this night would not end the way he imagined. And then he cleared his throat, tapped his glass with a fork, and started to stand to make his announcement, and I felt my shoulders relax because I knew I had already made mine. Dad tapped his glass like he was calling a meeting to order, and he stood with that practiced smile he uses when he wants credit for being decisive, and he started talking about legacy and responsibility and gratitude. And he took his time because he enjoys the pause before the reveal. And when he finally got to the point, he said he had put his affairs in order, and that the house and the savings and the accounts and the insurance and the business shares would go to Emily because she was the one who kept things close to home, and he said it in that tone that tries to sound neutral while slipping in a little praise shaped like a knife. And I felt the table tilt as everyone arranged their expressions into supportive interest while pretending this was merely practical and not a performance designed to make sure I understood my position. He kept going because he always keeps going when he feels proud of himself, and he talked about how I had done fine on my own and how he admired my independence, which in our family is the polite word for you will be fine without help. And he threw in a line about how I never wanted to be tied down, which is not true, but it makes the story easier to sell when the ending has already been written, and I watched Emily accept the praise with that careful look she gets when she wants to appear humble while counting the benefits, and I could feel that old pull toward defending myself rising in my throat, that urge to list the years and the receipts and the times I was there when no one else was, and I caught it before it moved. Because I am done auditioning for fairness in a room that does not cast me. He referenced the will, and he said everything had been handled, and he kept using the word clarity like a shield. And I sat there with my hands folded and my face calm, and I thought about how many times a decision gets dressed up as logic when what it really is comfort, and I realized he expected me to either fight or cry or pretend to agree. And I decided to do none of those things because I did not come to feed the story that I am the one who cannot handle news. I came to watch a choice be stated out loud and to let it sit in the air without giving it extra support, and that is harder than it sounds when every part of you wants to shout you are rewriting history and calling it love. He opened the floor for toasts again as if we had just heard something inspiring, and a couple of relatives said the usual lines about family unity and doing the right thing, and one aunt squeezed my shoulder like I was a child who had dropped her ice cream. And Emily thanked everyone for trusting her with the legacy and said she would keep the house as a place for holidays because she knows how to pitch herself as the reliable one, and I let all of it pass through me because engaging with a script that is not yours is like pouring water into someone else's bucket. It empties you and fills nothing you can use, and I am done pouring. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly because I wanted my voice to be steady, and I wanted my eyes to be clear, and I raised my glass, and I said that I was glad Dad had taken steps that made him feel settled. And I said I hoped he felt lighter for having said it out loud, and I thanked everyone for being here, and then I added that I was also feeling settled these days, that I had been tying up a few loose ends of my own, and that I had learned the value of getting things in writing early rather than late, and I watched Dad blink because he knows how to read between my lines even when he pretends not to, and I watched Emily tilt her head because she does not like it when I sound calm after being handed something that should knock me flat. I did not explain myself because explanations are a form of begging when the room is committed to misunderstanding you, and I am past that, so I kept the toast short enough to be polite but long enough to plant a seed. And I sat down and took a slow sip of water and let the silence do the work I used to try to do with speeches, and in that pocket of quiet I felt an old muscle unclench, because I was not waiting for permission to feel what I felt. I was simply letting them live with what they had said, and I was letting myself live with what I had already done. Dad tried to reset the mood by making a joke about me always being the practical one, and a few people laughed because they did not know what else to do, and I nodded as if we were all just sharing a moment of harmless family banter. And I let my phone buzz in my purse because I knew who it was, and I knew what the message probably said, and I did not need to look at it to feel the ground steady under me, and that is when I realized the small satisfaction of the night was not in arguing or winning a point. It was in taking back the frame, which is its own kind of revenge, because when you refuse to play the part written for you, the play loses its grip, and the people who relied on it have to wonder what else they misread. And I will admit that felt good in a way I did not expect, and it made me ready for what came next. After the applause thinned out and the plates were traded for coffee cups and leftover jokes, the part of me that always wants to justify itself started flipping through old files in my head. Those moments you tell yourself you are over until someone touches the same bruise, and you realize it never really healed. And I remembered the semester when Emily needed a car because the commute was too hard and Dad found a way to make it happen without a single lecture about budgeting, while I covered 2 shifts a day to pay for textbooks and heard a speech about how learning to grind would build character. And I remembered the year Mom got sick and I took unpaid time to shuttle her to appointments because I lived closest, while Emily promised to visit more often and was praised for meaning well. And I remembered the polite little story the family told about me being independent and practical, which was a tidy way to say I could be counted on to carry what other people dropped because I would not make a scene about it. It sounds petty when you list it out like that, yet it is not about the individual favors or the receipts I could pull from a folder. It is about the pattern that trains you to feel lucky for scraps and guilty for wanting a seat at the table. And when you realize the pattern is not an accident but a preference, you either stay in it and keep asking for crumbs with a smile, or you step outside of it and figure out how to hold your own plate, which is what I started doing last year when I had a small disaster of my own and needed a hand, and Dad told me I would be fine because I always land on my feet, and Emily texted a heart and a prayer and went on with her week. And I sat with the quiet that follows a polite no and decided that if I was going to be expected to manage alone, then I would learn how the quiet power works, the kind of power that does not ask permission. It started from something that looks boring to anyone who has never had to untangle property details, because while I was refinancing my condo, I spent a lot of time in county records and title reports. And once you learn how to read those databases, you start to see stories in parcel numbers and old signatures, which is how I stumbled onto a map of Dad's subdivision and noticed a note about a ground lease that the developer set up long ago. The kind of arrangement that most homeowners never think about because the payments are built into autopay and the notices arrive from a management company with a bland name. And I thought about Dad's proud way of saying he owns his house outright and how our family loves that phrase because it sounds like certainty. And I wondered how certain it really was if the land beneath the wood and drywall was leased from an entity that did not have our last name on it. I asked a few questions that did not sound like questions. I called the number on a notice most people would throw away, and I learned that the company holding the land interest had been shopping some of its portfolio because of a messy year and a tax issue. And I asked a title officer I trust what that might mean for a house like Dad's, and he said it means whoever owns the land sets the terms for the ground rent and the renewals and the permissions for certain changes, and if the lease switches hands, the new owner can ask for updated terms within the rules. And I sat with that information the way you sit with a card you are not sure you will play, because I am not reckless and I am not cruel. I was just tired of being told I should clap while someone else narrates my limits. While Dad kept telling the table that clarity was a gift and Emily kept thanking everyone for trusting her, I let my phone rest against my palm because I had scheduled a message for this evening that would only be sent if I typed one small phrase. And I watched the people who taught me to call my own needs dramatic, and I considered the years I had already given to keeping the peace, and I decided that if I was going to be painted as the practical one, then I would be practical in a way that actually protected me, which is another way of saying I had already positioned myself to purchase the landlord's side of that ground lease if the paperwork came together, and the paperwork was very close. I raised my glass again like I was going to add a cheerful tag to the evening, and instead I said something that sounded harmless unless you knew the context. Because I looked at Dad and I said I hoped his mail was getting to the right place these days since companies love changing addresses on notices without warning, and I mentioned that county offices can be slow updating contact records unless someone nudges them. And the air shifted a little as he asked what mail I meant, and I smiled like I was just making conversation and told him I had been spending too much time with clerks lately and everything starts to sound like a reminder, and he nodded because looking concerned makes him feel responsible. And Emily looked at me like I was speaking a language she did not enjoy hearing, and I let the silence sit there long enough to plant its root. Then I glanced at my phone and typed the 2 words I had promised myself I would not send unless I was sure, because there is a difference between petty revenge and a boundary set with precision, and I am not interested in petty. So I slid my thumb over the screen and sent a quiet signal to the attorney who had been waiting for me to confirm, and the message was simple and ordinary and would not make sense to anyone who saw it, yet it carried enough weight to change the ground under the story. Because it told him to file the assignment and release the notices first thing in the morning, which meant the next time Dad tried to use his house as a prop he would be standing on terms he did not set. And as I put my phone away, I felt the old urge to explain rise up and then fade, and I let it go because the explanation would arrive on its own, and it would not be coming from me. When I got home that night, I set my phone face down and let the quiet expand, because I knew if I started explaining to anyone why I was calm, I would ruin the part of this plan that mattered. Which was not the gotcha moment people love to imagine, but the certainty that things were already in motion whether anyone applauded or not. And, since you are hearing this as a friend, I will tell you the part one kept to myself for months. The part that did not look like revenge because it involved spreadsheets, phone calls where my voice stayed steady, and a pile of documents with dull titles that ended up carrying more weight than any speech I could have delivered at that table. I did not wake up one morning and decide to buy the land under my father's house, because that would be reckless and theatrical, and I am neither. I am the person who notices patterns. And the pattern that finally pushed me was a slip from Aunt Carol while she was bragging about how organized Dad had become, because she said he and Emily had spent an afternoon with a lawyer updating beneficiaries so there would be no confusion later. And she said it in that cheerful way people use when they assume you are on the winning team, and even though I smiled and said that sounded responsible, I went home and let myself feel the sting long enough to tell the truth, which was that I had been given enough reminders of my rank in this family, and I was done taking notes from the cheap seats. You already know I stumbled on the ground lease while refinancing my condo, and that discovery turned into a project I handled the way I handle everything that matters, which is to break it into parts one can control. So I started with a lawyer who does not care about family drama and who only speaks in terms of filings, timelines, and risk, and I liked him immediately because he did not ask me why I wanted to do this. He only asked whether I understood that owning the land means setting the terms beneath the structure but not owning the structure itself, and when I said yes, he laid out the steps in a tone that sounded like a train schedule, and I followed every line. The company holding the ground interest had taken a beating in a bad year and was offloading parcels to clean up a balance sheet, which meant I was not special to them. I was simply solvent and fast. And that suited me fine because the less attention this purchase attracted the better, so I formed a small company with a boring name that looks like every other boring name on county records. I pulled together funds from a refinance I had already planned, a line of credit I qualified for without asking anyone for help, and cash I had saved because being the practical one teaches you to keep an emergency drawer even when no one thanks you for it, and I negotiated terms that were ordinary on paper and decisive in practice, like a requirement that any transfer of the house into a new trust or to a new owner would need the landowner's written consent, and a reset clause that adjusted the ground rent modestly on transfer, which is standard language but becomes powerful when the transfer is the entire point of someone's plan. We recorded the assignment quietly because there is nothing noisy about a clerk stamping a document, yet once the stamp lands, the universe of a property shifts by a few degrees that only matter when you try to move it. And I made sure notices would be mailed to every address on file because I wanted the paper trail to be clean and unemotional. And I added a courtesy requirement that substantial changes to the exterior would need landowner approval because I know my father loves to frame projects as proof of control, and I did not intend to micromanage his life. I only intended to remove his ability to use the house as a weapon in family politics, and if he wanted peace and normalcy, he could have it by doing what everyone else does, which is to sign the forms and pay the bill on time. The part that felt like a small private victory came earlier that same week when the seller forwarded the estoppel packet that confirmed the lease terms and arrears status, because reading that packet was like sliding a key into a lock, simple and satisfying. And I signed the papers with a clear head and told my attorney to hold the assignment until I gave the word, which is the text I sent from the dinner when I typed those two quiet words, because I wanted the filing to hit the recorder in the morning after the announcement so that whatever story Dad and Emily told themselves about certainty would be honest for exactly one night and no longer, and I will admit there was a cruel symmetry in that timing. Not because I enjoy cruelty, but because I have become tired of being the only one who swallows it. By sunrise, the receipt from the recorder's office sat in my inbox like a bland confirmation of a package delivered, and the management company had already generated the required change notice addressed to the leaseholder with the new remittance information and the updated consent language. And I stared at that draft for a long minute because it represented a different kind of power than the one I grew up around. Not the power to humiliate or to boast, but the power to set the rules quietly and let other people decide how loudly they want to crash into them. And I forwarded the notice to a courier with instructions to require a signature, and then I made coffee and told myself I would not answer my phone when it rang, even though we both know I did. Because when Dad's number flashed and he asked if I had seen an odd letter about the land under his house, I said yes and suggested we talk in person, and before he could ask the question I knew was coming, I told him I had time this afternoon. Which is how the stage got set for the only reveal that ever mattered. Dad arrived with Emily like this was going to be a quick cleanup call where he would soothe me with a kind tone and a few talking points about how families work best when everyone understands their role, and he started exactly there because he always does, telling me the letter about the land had to be a mistake and asking whether I could help him figure out which office to call, and I let him finish, because interrupting only gives a person room to start over. Then I slid the copy of the recorded assignment across the table with the receipt stapled to the corner, and I told him there was no mistake to fix because the landowner listed there was a small company that I owned. And the quiet that followed felt less like drama and more like ventilation because for the first time in a long time nobody was performing. They were just processing the fact that the ground was no longer an assumption, but a choice I had made on purpose. He said something about loyalty and how families do not do this to each other, and I told him families do not set up birthday dinners to humiliate one child in favor of another either. So maybe this was the moment to stop pretending that our traditions were loving just because we kept repeating them, and I kept my voice steady because I did not come here to erupt. I came here to lay out terms that were already in place and to offer him the easiest path through them, which was simple and decent. And entirely within his reach, because the lease he had been paying would change almost nothing for him while he lived there as long as he kept the account current and did not try to transfer the house without the landowner's written consent. A phrase that sounds cold until you remember who decided to turn the house into a stage. Emily jumped in with a speech about how I was trying to control Dad's retirement home and how that was cruel, and I told her what was cruel was building an inheritance announcement into a celebration and calling it practical, and that I had no interest in Dad's day-to-day life being uncomfortable, which is why the rent was steady and the rules were ordinary, and that the only time the terms would flex was if the house changed hands, which was exactly the scenario Dad had just described while lifting a glass at dinner, and I watched her realize that this was not a stunt or a tantrum, but a boundary with paperwork, which is harder to mock because it stays where you put it. Dad asked what I wanted, and because I have learned that the only way to keep the air clear is to use words that fit in a single breath, I told him I wanted him to live without fear that I would yank anything out from under him. And I wanted to stop being treated like a backup generator you only notice during an outage, and I wanted the will to stop being used like a scoreboard where generosity is measured by applause. And since none of that fits on a legal form, I had translated it into something that does, which was an option that sat on the table in plain language. Namely, that he could keep everything as is while he lived, and after that he could put the house into a trust that lists both daughters as beneficiaries with a right of first refusal for either of us to buy the other out at a fair appraisal. And if he signed that trust in the next week, I would sell the land to the trust for what I paid plus costs, cleanly, no markup, no victory lap, just an end to the game. Emily called it blackmail, and I told her it was a choice between two normal paths, one where she inherits a house that sits on land she does not control and pays a reset rent she cannot dictate and needs my consent for any transfer or refinance, and another where the family stops treating proximity as sainthood and writes down a fair structure that keeps both of us honest, and if she wanted to call that blackmail, she was free to do it, but the recorder's stamp does not care about her vocabulary, and neither does the bank that would eventually ask for my consent letter if she tried to put the property into her name under Dad's will. Dad sat very still, which I have learned means the performance part of his brain is tired, and he asked whether I would really sell the land for what I paid if he signed the trust, and I said yes, because I had no interest in being his landlord forever. I only wanted a seat at the table that did not depend on begging for a chair, and I reminded him that all of this could have been avoided if he had spoken to me like a daughter instead of an audience member, and he nodded in a way that told me the point had landed. Then he asked for the name of the attorney who set up my company, and I gave it to him without a speech, because I am done with speeches. And I told him the offer stood for 7 days, not because I was trying to corner him, but because procrastination is where our family hides its worst habits, and deadlines are how adults keep faith with decisions. When they left, Emily looked back like she wanted one more round, and I let the look pass because the conversation had moved out of feelings and into facts, and facts are patient, and that is where I plan to keep it, so I poured water, opened the window, and let the day find its own level while my phone lit up with a text from Dad asking me to send the trust language again for his review, and I typed it out and hit send without flourish, because the satisfaction for me was never in a dramatic reveal. It was in knowing that I finally played the game I had been drafted into with rules that did not require me to set myself on fire for approval, and whether he signs this week or the next, whether Emily calls me names in the group chat or runs out of them, the truth is set. The ground is different, the choices are honest, and for the first time in a long time I am not waiting for a seat because I brought my own table. And the door is open if they want to sit at it, but if they do not, the ground will still be mine.